Greetings! You are looking at a kiln filled with 10 beautifully glazed cassowary mugs. How did we get here? How long did it take? I'm so glad you asked. This is the culmination of a week of work in the studio. And this week, I'm going to take you with me on every step of the process. Okay, we have got 3 different cassowary quota goals. Quota 1, casting. We're going to cast 12 new cassowary mugs. So we're going to take the slip out of the slip tank, cast it into those molds, and make 12 new mugs. Quota 2, bisque fire 12 cassowary mugs. Those 12 will be the ones that we did the week before, which will be dry by now, and we can put them into the bisque kiln for a bisque firing. And quota 3, the final one, is 12 glazed cassowary mugs. So we are moving, all told, 12, 24, 34, 36 cassowaries through the kiln, through the process every week. And at the end of every week, we have 12 finished mugs. Whew, that's a lot. And that is why I write everything down. A big part of my Monday morning ritual is erasing last week's to-do list and making a new to-do list for every single day of the week. I find it satisfying. It lets me know that I did a lot of work last week, and it really helps me keep my mind clear as I make my way through every day of the new week. Not only did I have a glaze kiln full of 12 mugs, I also had this bisque firing with another 12 mugs that are ready to go. These I had to take out of the kiln and get onto the shelf to make room for this week's work. Now that we've got room in the kiln, we can take these mugs, which were cast last week and are now perfectly dry, and put them in for a bisque firing. And I'm not going to fire them right away because we still are going to put a few more underglazed mugs in when we spray them today, maybe tomorrow, I don't know. But we got to leave room for those in the kiln as well. But all right, let's just get these in. Let's get these in there. Not going to lie, it's always a little stressful packing greenware into the kiln. Remember, this is not fired. The only thing holding this together is, I don't know, just the sheer force of will of the clay particles. They are extremely fragile, and I want to pack them in as tightly as I can to leave room for the next 12 underglazed mugs that we're going to be doing later today. All right, it is underglaze time. I'm going to be using Amico Velvet underglazes, and underglazes are nice because they kind of are like the acronym WYSIWYG, which is what you see is what you get, and that's mostly true for underglazes. These colors can be mixed just like normal paint, and you will get what you see to a degree. Now, blacks don't look as black as they do when they're fired. When I go through the kiln, it's going to look much darker. So I'm taking a terracotta, I'm adding some black to it. I'm doing, I think, 4 parts of terracotta to 1 part black, something like that, or 3 to 4, I don't know. It's in my notes. And what we're going to be glazing, well, we're going to be glazing these. These are the 12 bisque pieces that we took out of the kiln that we fired over the weekend. Now we are going to be spraying ceramic underglaze, so we want to protect our lungs with a respirator, and we are going to protect our ears from the noisy booth with these little ear muffs. We're going to be spraying the underglaze onto the skull portion of the bird, well, skull, and the bottom. I'm going to be doing 2 coats after putting on the first coat, a nice even coat everywhere. I use our handy dandy Coat-O-Matic coat counter and move on to coat number 2, getting all 12 of the birds. All right, as crazy as it sounds, after spraying all of that underglaze onto the mugs, we're going to wipe it all away. Well, not all of it, just the high areas, the raised areas. We want to make these skulls look ancient, like they were discovered on a jungle floor. And to do that, we're going to need some water and a sponge. What I'm doing is carefully rinsing the underglaze away from the raised areas. And I'm just kind of doing this by eye. I want this to look like something that has had dirt, jungle grime, mud, whatever, kind of settling into the lower portions of the mug. And the raised areas are, they're worn away. This thing has been kicked along the floor of the jungle. Maybe some other critter has been pecking away at the carcass of this bird on the jungle floor. I don't know. I like it to tell a story. This is an old ancient skull that perhaps an explorer, perhaps an adventurer, perhaps another jungle animal has found on the bottom of the jungle floor. After wiping all 12 mugs, it is time to check off the first item on our weekly to-do list and grab some lunch. Today it is peanut butter, jelly, and banana sandwiches. Okay, I'm back from lunch, and these are nice and dry. How do I know they're nice and dry? Well, they're not cold to the touch. When the water evaporates out of this very porous bisque clay, it has a cooling effect. So when I hold this next to my skin, it doesn't feel cool, it feels room temperature, so I know that it's ready for the next step. And what is the next step? Well, we're going to have to mask all of these. And this is the part that gets rather tedious. Now, there's lots of different ways to mask things. In past episodes, I have explored those different techniques, but I'm going to go with what is usually my favorite, good old blue painter's tape. So we're going to attach a bunch of strips of this tape down to the table. Why am I doing this? Well, I'm going to cut these strips into even smaller strips using an X-Acto knife. I put my old blade from last week into this little jar that keeps them safe, and we make a bunch of little strips. Now these strips I will then put along the division line between what we want to paint and what we don't want to paint, and then I go and cut that line nice and clean with an X-Acto knife so I get a great edge. Once I've got that edge, I move on to covering the rest of the skull. This is all the area that I don't want to get any bright color on. And the skull is fine the way it is. And to do that, I use this tape attached to, well, I guess it's like a paper. Painters use this when they're painting walls and they want to protect trim work on houses. But I find it's a really fast way to cover large areas of the clay that I don't want to get any paint on. Once these are all done, they go onto the shelf and they are ready for spraying. All right, we are back into the spray booth, and we're going to spray 3 different colors of underglaze onto the cask. We're going to do yellow for most of it, and then I come back with an orange band, and then a slight, very, very slight red band, which I'm going to kind of vary through the addition. This is a bit of a humbug spray situation because the 3 colors means 3 times I have to clean the gun in between spraying. I don't know how much of that I'm going to film because it's a lot to juggle and I want to make sure that I don't mess these up, but I'll try to capture as much of it as I can. And I'm excited because we're kind of in the home stretch. After this, we're going to peel the masking off, do a fine little strip around the edge and get them into the kiln for a second bisque fire to set this underglaze so that it doesn't shift when we move through the next steps of the glazing process on the next days of the week. But enough talking, let's start spraying. So we're going to go in 12 times for 12 mugs with just the first yellow base coat of underglaze. After I get all of the yellow on, we quickly clean the gun and we hop onto an orange pass. We're just doing half of this in orange. Then we clean the gun again and do a very subtle red stripe on the base of the mugs. All right, this Monday is winding down, and as crazy as it sounds, after we spent all that time masking it, I'm going to pull all the masking off. These are just about ready to bisque, but before we do that, masking's got to come off, and I'm going to do one little final pass, which I'll get to in a minute after I pull all of this masking off that we painstakingly put on just about an hour ago. All right, so we're at the final, you know what? I'm not going to say final step because it's not the final step, is it? Putting it in the kiln will be the final step for Monday. But it's the penultimate step, my favorite word, and that is we're going to use this fine lining brush to just put a line of the terracotta and black mixed underglaze along the kind of the transition point between the cask and the skull. So that's what we're going to do right now. I've got my water, I have got my brush, I have got my underglaze. While doing stuff like this in the studio, I usually listen to audiobooks, and this week's audiobook is, I think it's HMS Surprise. It's one of the Master and Commander series books, and yes, it is like the 3rd time I've listened to all of these books. Okay, it's 4:45. Just finished all the final lining. Let's get these into the kiln and call it a day. As satisfying as it is to load all of our day's efforts into the kiln and press the start button, it's not even close to the satisfaction I get when I check off these little check boxes on my to-do list. Yes, I am obsessive about it, and I feel no shame. I feel no shame. It makes me feel good to check off little boxes on a to-do list. All right, it is a slip casting day, and the very first thing I do as I wake up is I prepare our leak stoppers. So if you watched our making of the Cassowary mold video, you realize that those molds are not perfect because no mold ever is. And I found the best way to prevent the little leaks that happen in a one thin spot on the mold is by doing this. I put some slip out onto some plaster so that it sets up while I prepare the rest of the molds for today's casting adventure. Much like playing a very heavy game of Tetris, I've got to move these molds around to make them fit. The first thing we need to do is get into the slip table so that we can stir up the slip, get it nice and liquid. I do this with the slip motor, and then I also go in with this big paddle to kind of just start the things up. You want to get the slip moving for a good 10 minutes so that it's nice and fluid before we put it into the molds. Once the slip is going, I can put all the molds back onto the slip table where they'll be in position for casting, and we just let that slip run for 10 minutes. Now, while the slip is running and warming up, I'm going to go and just check on the kiln. Remember, we did a bisque firing last night, and I want to see if it is ready to open. Spoiler, it isn't. It's still too hot. All right, the 10 minutes is up, and it's time to pour slip. But before we do, we've got to plug those holes. So I go back to these little kind of slip puddles that I made, which have now congealed into, I don't know, kind of like a leathery type of clay, which I roll into a little burrito and stuff into the area that is going to leak on the molds. I know it's going to leak at this key, and it's going to leak at this intersection where these mold parts come together. It's just too thin. I should have made the mold differently, but I didn't. But it's okay, because we know that this will stop the leaks, and everything will turn out just fine in the end. I plug all 6 leaks, and we are ready to pour some slip. I pour the slip through this pasta strainer for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of just unifies the flow of slip, and 2, it catches any chunks or impurities that might be in the slip so that they don't end up inside of the mug. Now, you're going to notice as I go through and fill these, I want you to keep an eye on this first mold, this mold number 6, because it's going to look like the slip is leaking. The slip level is going to be dropping, but it's not leaking. What is happening is the magic of slip casting. The plaster mold is wicking the moisture out of the slip, and therefore the slip level is dropping in the mold. That is what's supposed to happen, but we don't want it to drop too far, so I will go back and refill it with this little condiment bottle, fill the slip, and I will continue to do this every 15 minutes until we've gone through our entire casting time, which is, for these molds, 1 hour and 20 minutes. Now, as a rule, I try to design molds so that they have a well, an area in the top of the mold that will hold enough slip so that as the slip is getting wicked into the mold, there is extra slip that will fill that volume, and I don't have to constantly top them off. But this mold is already really big, so I didn't want to put a well on the top because it would just make the mold even bigger, and I can barely pick these things up as they are right now. Okay, it's like, I think 7:12. I'm a little more awake at this moment, and it is time to flip these molds. Now, I'm going to shuffle a bunch off to the table, and then I'm going to start draining them. And to drain them, I'm using my advanced silicone tubing with a snippet of a McDonald's straw on the end to inject air into these molds. These molds have a small opening on them, which means there's not a lot of room for air to get into them while the slip comes out, which can create suction, which can create a vacuum, which will sometimes pull the mold, the mug wall away from the mold, which is, we want to avoid that. So I'm going to inject air into this while I flip it. Let's just do it. You'll figure out what's happening when it's happening. And yes, these are exceptionally heavy with the slip inside of them. Just trying to get the little extra bit out of the tip of the cask or the crest. Okay. So we repeat the process for the rest of the 5 remaining molds, and I can tell you that I wasn't originally planning on using the air bladder tube thingy, but I found out when I was casting the AP glaze testers that there was just enough suction to cause an issue, so I figured that using the tube would be better safe than sorry, and it's been working great. All the castings have been coming out perfectly. Okay, I'm going to let these sit here for 15 minutes before I flip them over and reset the slip casting table. 15 minutes later, I did just that. I flipped all the molds over so that they could dry out a little better. You want that pour spout to be facing up, and I covered the slip table so it wouldn't dry out. All right, it is 9:45. Breakfast was fabulous. I spent the time after breakfast starting to edit the very video you're watching right now, and it is time to open up these molds and see how today's castings turned out. This little wooden cooking tool from New Zealand that my brother gave me years ago for Christmas is what really saved the day. It lets me reach really deep into the pour spout of the mold and pull out this plug of clay. This lets me then open up the mold using these handy dandy mold pliers. I'm going to put a link to these in the description of the video. And from there on out, it's just a simple open up the mold and demold it. You can see that before I take the casting out, I go ahead and seam the bottom edge of the mug. It's just easier this way while it's being cradled in the mold. Once I got that seam taken care of, I carefully pull it out and deliver it to Denise. My partner Denise is over there seaming away while I go and demold the other 5 Cassowary casting mugs for the day. Once I get all 5 of them done, I then hop on to seaming myself, and I usually have time to seam 2 of the 6 daily castings. Here I am working on one of the 2 mugs that I get to do during the day. You can see I'm just cleaning everything up. I'm removing the flashing around the edges of the mug. We're using sponges. I'm using my fingertips. I'm using a variety of tools to try to make the mug look smooth, clean, and pristine. And once it looks like that, then it gets to join the 5 other, well, let's see how many. Yeah, we did 6, so there's 5 other ones there on the table. And we're done casting for today. All right, it's lunchtime. The kiln is still at like 300 degrees, so I'm just going to head off for lunch now with the hopes that it is cool enough for me to do the interior of the mugs after lunch. I'm probably not going to have time to do the masking and spraying and bump that to tomorrow, but it's still a good... Oh, Denise just pulled up with the car. It's time to take last week's mugs to the post office. All right, we are back from lunch and our post office trip, and it's time for editioning. I keep track of our current casting count and edition numbers on this little chart that lives above the slip casting table, and I do all of the marking with this tool that I bought in Japan over 25 years ago. I absolutely love it. It's got this nice sharpened chisel tip that I think does a great job on marking the numbers on the bottom of our mugs. While I was numbering today's castings, I had a window open in the kiln room and the kiln open with the hopes that it would reach a cool enough temperature for me to start doing the insides of the mugs. And guess what? We pulled it off. So I quickly unloaded the kiln and stacked them all up so that we could do the insides. And look at the way they look in the afternoon sunlight. So good. You can see that the colors definitely intensified on the underglaze after that bisque firing. To get glaze onto the insides of this mug, we're going to use some thinned down glaze, a little plastic cup, a sponge. We're also going to need some, well, a gigantic syringe and a whole bunch of water. Oh yeah, and I need this little wooden nubbin thingy. You'll see why in a minute. So where are we on our weekly progress? I'm so glad you asked. So we've got 3 groups of 12 Cassowary mugs that we're moving through the pipeline. The first group is the bisque castings. We wanted to bisque fire the castings that we did last week, and guess what? They're done, as you saw me put them on the shelf just hopefully a few scenes ago. The next group of castings, or the next group of cassowaries, is the ones that we're going to be glazing this week, and that's these here. So I would say they're about halfway through the glazing process. So they're moving along pretty well. And the final group is the 12 new castings that we have to do this week. And as of today, we have got 6 of those done. So we're halfway through that goal. And we will cast the remaining 6 on Thursday. So we're doing pretty good. I cannot complain. Let's get the glaze on the inside of these. So I got this little block of wood. I made these when we were doing the Suffering Bastard mugs, and I used these to kind of angle the molds while they dwelled. And this actually works out really well for helping me get glaze into the nooks and crannies on the cassowary. Allow me to demonstrate. So the first thing I do is pour some thinned glaze. Now this is just slightly thinned. It's a little too thick when you get it right from the manufacturer. So I add a touch of water and I pour a small amount in. Now I then very carefully rotate the glaze inside of the mug so that it doesn't spill out. And I'm using a brush here to get the lip around the opening of the mug. Once I got that done, it's time for the giant syringe. That is the craziest sound. It is indeed the craziest sound. I then squirt all of that glaze back into my pour cup, and you'll notice that the mug is resting on the block of wood. That's how I keep all the glaze inside down kind of one corner to make it easier to suck out. I then repeat the process 12 times, well, I guess 11 times because you saw me do it once there, and once it's done, the insides are all complete. All right, I think that calls it for today. Tuesday is in the books. Of course, there's one more thing I need to do before I head back inside, and I think you know what that is. All right, it is Wednesday, and at this point, I should talk about the fact that I don't do these mugs all week long. I plan time for other stuff to happen. That other stuff is other projects we're working on, or it's just other things that you have to do. Sadly, when you're self-employed, you don't get to spend your entire time creating. There's a lot of other businessy stuff that you have to do. So today is going to be taken up with a lot of other stuff. I think I'm only going to have time to do some masking this morning on the mugs, and that's pretty much it. I've got meetings today, I've got errands, I've got a haircut, I've got a bunch of stuff I got to do. Most of the time during the week, like I said, I will do other projects. In fact, we are intentionally only doing this amount of mugs per week to allow us time to do other projects. I think it's important. When we did the zombie jug, that kind of became all-encompassing. I didn't have the time to do anything else. And honestly, it really wore on me mentally. So Denise and I have learned that it's important to schedule time for a bit of a mental break, so you're not just diving into one thing all the time. Now, this week, I'm not doing many other things because I'm actually going to be editing what you're watching right now, and that's going to be taking up most of the extra time that we build into the week. But normally, while we're working on the mugs, I work on other artistic projects, which is quite nice. Anyway, we've only got about an hour, so let's try to get at least masking on half of these. What are we masking today? Well, we're going to be spraying the cask and the beak with glaze. We're using the same glaze that we used on the interior. So we need to cover the bone section of the skull, the scully bit, if you will, the non-beak, non-cask area. So it's time for some more blue tape. Fingernails. There we go. This process is almost identical to the one that we used when we did the gradient of yellow to red on the cask because we're masking the exact same area. I lay out my tape, I cut my squares, but I do it slightly differently. I'm putting some really fancy, tight little triangles on the ends of these because I'm not going to do a second pass with the X-Acto knife. Once I get my tape cut, I'm going to lay it down exactly where I want it to get a really nice crisp transition between the glazed cask and the just underglazed skull portion of the mug. Once I got the tape all laid out, you know what time it is. That's right, it's the paper tape. That tape that's kind of stuck to the little roll of brown paper, and I use that to cover the rest of the skull, basically every area that I don't want to get covered with glaze when we go into the spray booth. It's 2:45. I got my hair cut and I've got a meeting in about an hour and a half. I thought I'd have enough time to spray these because look, I was able to mask all 12 of the Cassowary mugs, but there's a big thunderstorm supposedly coming in, so I'm actually gonna just dash out for my run before the weather turns awful, and I will spray these tomorrow morning in between the castings that we do. Yeah, at least that's what I plan on doing if I can wake up enough to run the spray gun at 5:30 tomorrow morning. It is another casting day. This Thursday morning is going to be just like Tuesday morning, so we're going to go through this pretty quickly. It's the same setup, shuffling molds around, mixing up the slip. I'm going to patch all those little possible future leaks, and then we're going to fill every single mold up to the top with slip so that they can dwell for an hour and 20 minutes. It just so happens that an hour and 20 minutes will give us plenty of time to get glaze onto the cassowary mugs. That's right, we masked off the skulls yesterday, and today we're going to get glaze onto the cask and the beak. We are spraying a heavy glaze this time, no more underglaze, and this is where the spray gun that I use really shines. It is a pressurized spray gun. I talk all about it in another Tiki Technical Tuesday, which I will link to at the end of this video. And I do this for all 12 mugs, but we'll only show it on one. Once I got 3 coats on all 12 mugs and the proper amount of time elapsed, I flipped all 6 of today's castings and drained the molds. Those then sat for another 15 minutes before I righted them and closed up the slip table so that it wouldn't dry out so that I could head for breakfast. All right, it's 9:45. I was editing after breakfast, which was waffles, and I'm heading in to seam the castings with Denise, and we're going to talk about scheduling for next week and I guess next month. This process goes just like it did on Tuesday, so I'm not going to show too much of it. The one thing I do want to really point out is, even though you really just see me in this video, Denise is the one that does most of the seaming of the mugs. Out of the 6 castings, she usually seams 4 of them, and I only have time to do maybe 1 or 2 if I'm lucky, because I spend most of my time opening the molds and cleaning the molds. In the end, we have the 6 castings, and you know what time it is. My favorite. That one's a satisfying one, because if you remember our quota, our cassowary quota, we had to bisque fire, we had to cast, and we had to glaze. So we have completed the bisque ones, and we have now just completed the cast ones. We are 24 mugs through our 36 mug quota, and it feels nice. Oh, that is rough. I am back from lunch. I was about to get started and I dropped the receiver for my wireless microphone on the cement studio floor and it's not working anymore. Oh, this kills me. This was not a cheap studio investment. So bummed about this. Anyway, we just have to go with the audio from the phone, and I hope that you can hear me okay. Let's move on. So we're in the home stretch. I'm going to take the masking off of the birds, and then I'm going to wipe back some of the glaze. The casks on the cassowary have this really incredible color shift where they go from this kind of black, like a jet black color, to a really vivid color. So if you remember, we have that really vivid underglaze hiding underneath this glaze. So we're going to sponge away the overglaze, the glaze itself, this dark color, to reveal the bright colors underneath. All right, just 12 more masks to remove. It is time to capture my favorite thing about real cassowaries, and that is the contrast of colors that they have on their cask. I do this by carefully sponging away this dark black glaze to reveal the bright underglazes that we sprayed at the beginning of the week. I do this one at a time, and eventually I get through all 12 of this week's birds. Before jumping into the spray booth for the final time this week, I need to edition today's castings. They have dried enough for me to mark the number on the bottom, so I carefully check the log to make sure I write the correct numbers on the bottom, painstakingly mark each and every single one, and set them on the drying rack to dry out before their firing, which will happen next week. Okay, everybody, this is it. Our final voyage through the spray booth this week. It is exciting? Well, it's exciting for me because we've been doing a lot of spraying. What's the final step? Well, we're doing a clear matte coat on the birds. And basically, I'm just doing this in several areas. I'm going to do a light pass on the skull section and a very light pass on the portion of the casque that we wiped the glaze, the dark glaze, away on. I just do 2 coats of this, and I work my way through each bird. Once they've got both coats on, it is time for the final firing. Okay, this is it. Hopefully you can hear me over the hissing. We are going to load the kiln with these completely glazed Cassowary mugs. And we're going to end up where this video began, inside of our kiln for a glaze firing. We carefully load each bird, making sure it's not touching its neighbor or the walls of the kiln itself, and then we do the so satisfying wonder of checking off the final things on our weekly to-do list. We made it to Friday, and it's time to check in on our quota. Now, I did not actually work in the studio at all today. I was editing this very video that you're watching, but I did have to pop in this afternoon because the kiln has cooled, which means we can do the final tally. When I say cool, it's actually still quite warm, but I've let it get to 200 degrees. That's the temperature that I feel it is safe to open up, peek, and examine how the firing turned out. Spoiler, it looks incredible. First up, we have hit our goal of 12 bisque mugs. We've hit our goal of 12 new cast mugs, and we have hit our goal of 12 fired mugs. The glaze turned out beautifully. I want to thank you for joining me on this adventure. If you have not subscribed to our channel, please do. It means the world for me. And I'm going to put some other links on this side or this side. I don't know where they're going to pop up for videos that you might enjoy if you've enjoyed this one. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you on the next episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday.